Canada is a lot of things. A country with a highly educated population, a country rich in natural resources like critical minerals. But one area where we're lagging is productivity. You've probably heard of the term. It gets thrown around a lot when it comes to the economy and the job market.
It is essentially measuring the quantity or the value of a product per unit of inputs that is used to generate that product in a given period. A product here can be either a good or a service.
That's Patrick Perrier, the Economic Director of Forecasting at Scotiabank. He says Canada's productivity growth has fallen further behind the United States and weakened relative to some other G7 countries. Essentially, in the last decade, we're producing less products or services than our peers, and it's affecting our quality of life.
If productivity performance had not slowed as we saw, I mean, it's big. We're not talking about a few $1 million here. It's billions, tens of billions of dollars that could be allocated to health, education, infrastructures.
Patrick joins us to talk about how Canada's productivity was stunted, what needs to be done to get it back on track, and what better productivity levels could mean for Canadians. I'm Armina Lagaya, and this is Perspectives. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Hi, happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
When we think about the word productivity, we think about, how much we can get done in a day, answering emails, cooking dinner, cleaning, those kinds of things. But in economic terms, what is productivity?
Well, I would say it is related to what you just said in a sense that it is essentially measuring the quantity or the value of a product per unit of inputs that is used to generate that product in a given period. A product here can be either a good or a service. And when I talk about production inputs, what I mean is that, it usually includes labor, capital, energy, raw and intermediate goods as well. And I would say that there are various concepts of productivity, but the one that is, usually discussed by economists and that we hear about in the media is what we call labor productivity. So essentially, when we look at labor productivity, what it does, it reports the quantity or the value of goods and services that are produced in a period per unit of labor input that is used during that period. What I mean by labor input, that could be measured either in terms of workers, or more often, I would say, the case, it's measured also in terms of total hours worked by these workers.
I'm going to dig into exactly how that's measured, how that's calculated, but maybe let's go to the more important point. Why is productivity so important? Why should the average Canadian care about productivity economically?
This is no stranger to the fact that those benefits that we often hear in the media are mostly about the impact this has on businesses, their productivity, and also for exporters, their ability to be competitive in external market, therefore to increase their exports to other countries. But those that affect, I would say, Canadians, citizens, are often not mentioned. So this is why I think it's important we get to this. So let's start just more macro level or macroeconomic indicators. Productivity is a key driver of those. When we hear about GDP or gross domestic product, which is basically an indicator of the level of economic activity, then productivity is affecting that. It affects as well employment. It affects inflation. And it also affects, given in Canada, we have the monetary policy objective is to keep inflation under control, then therefore it also affects policy and other interest rates as well. It's also affecting the competitiveness for Canadian businesses and also for workers on both the external and as well as domestic market. So higher level of productivity would allow businesses and workers to compete with their counterparts from other countries better. The size of the economy is also affected by productivity. It means then it drives as well revenues for governments in Canada. Because when the economy is larger, it means as well that the fiscal base is larger or the tax base is larger. Therefore, that means more revenues going to the governments, various levels of governments, with the same, I would say, tax burden for both individuals and businesses. And this is important. I think this is where this affects maybe the public more directly, because then that helps the governments to essentially provide more programs to citizens, more services transferred to maybe modest income households. And therefore, so this is impacting the quality of life of Canadians. So basically, to summarize, productivity is a driver, an important driver, in fact, of both standards of living for Canadians as well as their quality of life. So it is not just for businesses' profits or for helping exporters to gain market shares in other countries.
So, better productivity leads to, more competitive businesses, more GDP, keeps inflation in check, and potentially can also drive generation of jobs, as well as more money in the coffers for the government that in turn benefits citizens.
Exactly. And I would add to that is that what happens is the purchasing power goes up because when the firm becomes more productive, it helps to reduce its production costs, therefore can gain market share by reducing its price, so relative to its competitors, which means that then the firm would have an incentive to hire more workers in order to increase production to gain these market shares. Therefore, it means that would maybe increase the wage offered to those workers, current workers, so they stay, and also attract new workers. So this is, I would say, the channels through which over time it helps to raise household incomes.
So all good things if productivity goes up or is at least strong. How are we doing on productivity in Canada? Can you paint us a picture of what it's like now, what it was in the past?
Yeah, so first I'll start by saying data on productivity performance are very volatile. So if you look at it on I would say quarter-over-quarter basis, then it's very volatile. So for this reason, if you want a meaningful report card for productivity, we need looking at an average performance over a longer period to set the table for what happened, really, to understand the magnitude of the decline. So when we look from 1991 to 2014, Canada's labor productivity growth averaged 1.2% per year. But that performance weakened significantly after. So over that period, say over 2015, 2024, the average annual growth for productivity in Canada was 0.3% per year. This is a big decline. This is a 0.9 percentage point reduction in the growth rate of productivity. And just as a matter of comparison, when we look for U.S. economy, that, I would say, post-2014 decline in productivity performance was very modest, by less than 0.2 percentage point decline in the growth rate of productivity. Now, if we look to other members of G7, the measure of productivity has also slowed for those members, and Canada, therefore, is not the only one that witnessed a significant decline in its growth rate. And it was not the most severe among other countries in the G7, except US. But even though it was not the most severe, it's still concerning. The amount of extra revenues that we would have today, or the governments would be able to use if productivity performance had not slowed as we saw. It's big. We're not talking about a few $1 million here. It's billions, tens of billions of dollars that could be allocated to health, education, infrastructures.
I want to go back to the decline and ask you, why was it so drastic? What happened that just, made it take such a dramatic turn?
Yeah, well, certainly there's more than one factor, and it's always hard to come up with exactly why. Determinants of productivity include, the amount of capital, but also how high-tech this capital here. In terms of technology, do we have the capital that is the most up-to-date? There's also, I would say, the training, formation, education of the workforce, so the current workforce, but also future workforce. We're talking, of course, here about our children that are in school and young adults that are in college, universities. The other factors, of course, is how good businesses and workers are to combine various inputs to production together. So these are, I would say, the key drivers. But when we look since 2015, basically, there are two things that stand out is the investment expenditures by firms on capital has essentially stalled since then. So that means that there's basically a weakening in the ratio of productive capital per worker, which is a key determinant of productivity. Another factor that also contributed to that weakening in the ratio of productive capital per worker is strong population growth in recent years, mostly from increased immigration targets from 2022 until recently. So that means more worker probably has reduced the ratio of capital per worker, therefore has put downward pressure on productivity. There's also weak performance of technological progress. I would say mostly development, but also adoption. So when there's new technologies coming in, it seems that the rate of adoption diminished. So this also has contributed to that weakening in the productivity performance. And also there's sometimes the economy is getting hit by significant shocks. In this case, it requires that resources are reallocated across various sectors of the economy. Some example here of such shocks is, of course, the pandemic that we went through. You remember inflation going up after. Well, there was some, I would say, part of that was because of productivity performance. So there's the other factor that is at play or was at play since 2015 is the need to reallocate productive resources following significant economic shocks. Example of such shocks that happened since, I would say, the last 10 years or so are first negative oil price shock in 2014 from rising US shale oil production, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic.
So many factors go into this. And I wanted to go back to something you said about how the measures of productivity are volatile and sounds like pretty hard to track. Can you kind of explain why they are so volatile?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Well, the productivity is in fact the result from collective and not coordinated decisions of millions of businesses and workers. Governments also have a role in that through policies, regulations, and public infrastructures as well. The other layer of complexity is expectations about future business conditions and profitability from that project. So before investing, a firm or a business must balance the cost of this investment with the expected future profits. So if there's an elevated level of uncertainty, like we see now with the global trade tensions, then that means that there's more uncertainty about that profitability of a given investment project. So just to summarize, there are a lot of moving parts, which makes it very hard to predict the future path for productivity and also identify what would be the policy measures that would help improve it.
I think what we try to do around here in terms of the podcast is to demystify some of these concepts. And I feel like when people think about productivity, they think, I don't know, sometimes there's a bit of a connotation about, replacing workers or like trying to make people work harder. Is that the case? Can you sort of explain, at that level, what productivity really is?
Yeah, I mean, what you said, I would say it's some truth to it, but I would say it's usually not the case. And when it is the case, it is essentially a transitory situation. Not all productivity improvements are identical because they rarely come from the same sources or factors. So, for instance, suppose a firm gets better at combining labor with other production inputs or is modernizing its productive capital. This will reduce its production costs. Therefore, it will then lead a firm to hire more workers, given this opportunity to increase market shares and extract more profits by increasing production. However, when productivity improves because of game-changing factors, then yes, it might be disruptive for labor and reduce employment. So examples of such game changers are the industrial revolution of the 18th century, the invention and the widespread adoption of computers and software, as well as the internet. Artificial intelligence is also a potential game-changing development that could affect employment, but it's still unknown yet in terms of the impact on both productivity and employment. So in the short term, these game changers might lead businesses to reduce the size of their labor force, therefore reducing employment. But over the medium term to long term, this impact is getting reduced as these game changers are usually creating the need for different skills and new tasks for the economy. So therefore, over time, other types of jobs are getting created, often paying more. than those that are disturbed.
And I feel like that people are talking more about productivity even in the last few months. And I wanted to get your sense of, we've already established productivity is important, but why is it particularly important at this point in time in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, I would say again, because of the benefits I mentioned earlier, but of course, because of the trade tensions that have increased a lot since last year with the new US administration. So, in that context of global and geopolitical tensions, it puts more pressure on Canada to improve its productivity performance because that would help, for reasons I mentioned before, to mitigate the negative impact on the Canadian economy and our standard of living from these increased trade tensions. So, this is why I would say it's more important now.
And how can how can Canada improve its productivity?
There are various ways, but the first step is, in fact, for any problem, is to acknowledge that there's a problem and that it needs to be addressed. So it seems we passed this step, given governments have increased their focus on productivity and have made clear that they have the intention to improve it. But more technically, I would say that planned investment in infrastructure announced by the federal government is helpful because infrastructures or public capital is also complementary to private capital. Therefore, this is good for productivity because it would hopefully generate more investment, or that would help because it will increase the mobility of production inputs and reduce production costs for Canadian businesses. Other things, of course, make sure that the workforce is well educated and trained because that would help to do their, I would say, contribute to production better, increase their productivity, individual productivity, but also because it makes the workforce to be more flexible. Therefore, it's easier in this case to reallocate labor across different industries or sectors of the economy in case there's a need to do so. And of course, governments can look at the tax framework to make sure it stays competitive and attractive for investment projects in Canada. That means attracting either or inciting domestic firms to invest, but also attracting external investors to also invest in Canada. And of course, there's thinking about human capital. So make sure that we can attract and keep as well the brain power here in Canada.
And there's clearly some movement on that front, some steps taken, such as, the reduction of interprovincial trade barriers. What are your thoughts on where Canada is trending in terms of productivity? Is there a forecast with some of the changes over the last few years? What does the future of productivity in Canada look like right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of very heroic to forecast productivity for reasons I mentioned, but given it has an impact on so many indicators that we do need to forecast, then, I mean, we have no choice but to do it. So, we expect some improvement in productivity growth, given the increased focus by governments and some actions I mentioned. We also expect some gains from artificial intelligence. But again, this is what is I would say in terms of magnitude, this is still uncertain as of now. So again, we are hopeful that the government's plan for increasing public infrastructures would provide incentive for private investment projects, therefore will be good for productivity. And again, those trade barriers you mentioned. So therefore, we see an improvement in productivity performance going forward. But again, this is very uncertain. There's a lot of, I would say, confidence range around whatever forecasts of productivity we can come up with.
Is there anything we can learn from other countries? Are there other jurisdictions that were able to make significant improvements?
Yeah, there was, I would say those that come to mind for now is Ireland and Norway, and of course, China over last maybe 2 decades in the case of China. They all worked differently on the various drivers I mentioned for productivity. So working in terms of making the workforce educated, better trained, in some cases maybe more in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. So therefore having external investors coming and putting capital, productive capital in those countries. So these are, I would say, the broad measures that were used. Of course, to different, I would say, extent in each of those success stories.
And so for everyday Canadians like myself, I want to track the productivity, see how we're doing. Where would you find that? How would someone track that? It's just not as widely reported as, say, GDP, labor numbers. Where do you find that? How can you track that?
Yeah, I would say this indicator is reported frequently by Statistic Canada, and we can also find those indicators, some of those productivity indicators on the OECD or the International Monetary Fund's website. The OECD stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development.
What do you want people to take away from this conversation? What are, 3 things that are important to know about productivity?
Well, I mentioned the benefits, and I think it is very important that the public, if we want, because governments need the support of the public, government will have to decide how to use the resources they collect or tax revenues they collect from taxpayers, and have to decide, okay, how am I going to allocate this? They need to, of course, finance programs, services they provide to population, infrastructures, but also they need to think about, okay, some of that money to help improving productivity. So I think that the benefits, if we are clear about the benefits for citizens, then that helps to get public support, and for the government really to keep an eye on that ball for a sustained period, because those improvements won't come overnight. And even if you achieve a good performance, you want to maintain it. Therefore, that's a constant effort. It will affect Canadian standards of living, quality of life. And I think these are the things I want really people to keep in mind when they hear about the need to improve productivity performance in Canada.
I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you, Patrick, so much for breaking down this complex but obviously critical measure and concept for us.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It was a very pleasant discussion.
Thank you. I've been speaking with Patrick Perrier. He's the Director of Forecasting at Scotiabank. The Perspectives podcast is made by me, Armina Lagaya, as well as Ned Kelly and Natalie Nanowski. For a transcript of this episode, as well as other stories, insights, analysis, and thought leadership, visit our website, scotiabank.com/perspectives. We'll see you next time.